Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. So in amongst all of the stories and the teachings that you'll find in the early Buddhist scriptures, one of the names that comes up a lot is that of Ananda. Now Ananda was one of the followers of the Buddha, became his attendant. He was said to have been his cousin. And we don't know how true the accounts are. There might be some stories that were added much later. But whether or not we're meeting the real Ananda, I think he's probably my favourite character from the early texts. And for me, he acts as a personification of a number of positive traits. He's something of an archetype, you could say. And the word Ananda means joy, and is actually a reference in the Majjhima Nikaya to a local king, King Pasenadi, who saw Ananda and he asked, "Who's that happy-looking person?" And Ananda was reported to be good-looking. He's often described as having been gentle and very humble. And when the Buddha needed a reliable attendant, Ananda was approached and offered the job. And for the rest of the Buddha's life, Ananda took care of his daily needs. So he'd bring water, he'd guard him at night, he'd keep his dwelling place clean. And he dealt with the many people that wanted to come and see the Buddha. He was almost like a PA, really. And one of the reasons that he's so important is that he's said to have persuaded the Buddha to allow women to enter the order. And he also had an excellent memory. He was able to memorize the Buddha's teachings, ensuring they could be passed down over generations until they were put in writing hundreds of years later. So he's sometimes known as the treasurer of the Dhamma. And according to the scriptures, Ananda wasn't fully enlightened during the time that he was the Buddha's attendant. Although he comes across as deeply compassionate, he was still subject to worldly attachments. He was said to have made mistakes. And some suttas actually show Ananda asking the Buddha questions, trying to verify his understanding. And there are many other monastics that appear in the Pali Canon, and some of them, like Sariputta and Moggallana, are depicted as being very perfect, very saintly, having this very perfect understanding of the teachings. And Ananda comes across to me as being the most human, the most like us, and actually in some ways, as I said, the most likeable. And towards the end of the Buddha's life, Ananda knows that he's going to soon lose his teacher. And the Mahaparinibbana Sutta describes how they go walking from town to town, and the Buddha gets very sick. And when he recovers, he prepares Ananda for the fact that he's going to die. He prepares him for dealing with his remains after his death. And Ananda's just absolutely stricken with grief. He takes himself away, leans against the doorway, and he cries, "Alas, I remain but still a learner, one who has yet to work out his own perfection. And the Master is about to pass away from me, he who is so kind." And the Buddha summons him back and tells him not to weep. He says, "Enough, Ananda, do not grieve, do not lament. Did I not prepare for this when I explained that we must be parted and separated from all that we hold dear and beloved?" So the sutta really captures Ananda's deep emotional connection. He's a person of great sensitivity, great feeling. And again, later on, after the death of the Buddha and other senior monks like Sariputta and Moggallana, Ananda recites, "All the quarters are bedimmed, and the Dhamma is not clear to me. Indeed, my noble friend is gone, and all about seems dark. My friend has passed away. The Master too is gone. There is no friendship now that equals this, the mindfulness directed bodywards. The old ones now have passed away. The new ones do not please me much. Today alone I meditate, like a bird gone to its nest." So his sensitivity, in some ways, seems quite at odds with the Buddha's teachings on attachment and impermanence. You could see him as not being the perfect monk. And during his lifetime, he'd often be cautioned by other followers of the Buddha to devote more time to his own practice and less time talking to lay people. Although he was always diligent, he was always faithful, he actually fell behind some of the others in terms of his meditative attainments. And I think in some ways you could see him as a prototype for what later became the Bodhisattva ideal, in that he was much more concerned with service than he was with his own enlightenment. And it brings up the question, why is he actually regarded as one of Buddhism's most beloved figures? And why do I like him so much? I think in amongst all of his good qualities, he's just one of the most human. He's the most like us. And for me, his humanity makes him more helpful as a role model. than the arhants, in other words, the fully enlightened noble ones who never really show any deep emotions. They seem a lot more distant to me. And there might be people whose practice is so advanced that they don't experience grief or sadness. I don't know I've ever met any, certainly not one of them myself. So there's often sadness in me, and I think I'd rather open up to sadness and pretend it's not there. Because I don't think we can't really skate over that part of us. I think by allowing ourselves to feel, we cultivate a much deeper understanding of our own inner world. And this creates the conditions for us to open up to other emotional experiences, including joy. So by not running away from sadness, we can really create space for new positive experiences, including joy, to actually emerge. I've talked a lot before about how we engage with our emotions, how we practice letting them in rather than deflecting them or dissociating from them. Today I'm particularly interested in sadness. I think there's a reason for that based on personal experience, and it's about the power of sadness, the way it can actually shift our consciousness from one state to another. So if we're feeling very uptight, very self-absorbed, very disconnected or defended, maybe just really irritated or threatened by somebody else, maybe just annoyed by the whole world, then allowing in some sadness, letting it in, acknowledging it, it can be like flicking a switch. It can completely dismantle the barriers and take us into a space of being more open. Sometimes actually acknowledging the sadness underneath the surface can feel like a real relief. I don't know if you've ever felt better after a good cry, but it's that feeling when all the petty things that seemed so important just shrink down to nothing. That's what I'm really referring to. So when there's grief and sadness that we won't acknowledge, it can really sit in our gut like undigested food. It can come out in all sorts of ways, often as craving or irritation. And our attempts to avoid feeling sad can sometimes make it actually feel much worse. The barriers can go right up, and then when we finally admit it, that it's there, and we open up to it, suddenly there can be a shift, and we can experience it as a softening, a release. And the relief is palpable, it's often immediate. And if we truly open to it, instead of getting lost in shame or trying to repress it, it's a kind of awakening, maybe a brief one, or even just a glimpse, but maybe just a step towards awakening, but it's a real connection with who we really are. And the nun Pema Chodron said, this genuine heart of sadness can teach us great compassion. It can humble us when we're arrogant and soften us when we're unkind. It awakens us when we prefer to sleep and pierces through our indifference. This continual ache of the heart is a blessing that when accepted fully can be shared with all. So the stories of Ananda just being grief-stricken and weeping because he was about to lose his teacher and his friend, and then later expressing his sorrow that the Buddha and Sariputta and Moggallana are gone, they speak to me of somebody who's on the way to awakening, very much on the way to awakening. His sadness is never channeled into aggression or selfishness. He just feels it. He just simply feels it. And these moments of vulnerability and sadness really come across as being very authentic and human. And there's a number of references later on in the texts to Ananda's spiritual development after the first council. He's said to have become enlightened at the time of the first council, which was after the death of the Buddha. And he continued to teach the Dhamma for the rest of his life. As I said, I don't know whether the stories about Ananda are all true or whether some were added later, but it doesn't really matter that much to me either way. As I said at the start, to me, he's an example. He's an archetype. He's somebody to look to, I think, in terms of the unenlightened disciple who stays faithful and humble and compassionate while he walks the path. And he's never so completely consumed by his practice that he forgets to stop and talk to people along the way. And the way that he's always checking out his understanding, admitting when he's confused, and actually allowing in some feelings, allowing in some emotions, allowing his tears to flow when he's overwhelmed with grief. And for me, that's my kind of path, really. It's a path in which we're allowed to be imperfect. We're allowed to be human. Because I think it is really easy to get very self-absorbed and uptight about our practice. We can forget that life's short and every single moment matters. And if we can be completely honest about our imperfection, our complete lack of enlightenment, and the times when we lose our equilibrium and the times when sadness overwhelms us. If we can actually open up to that and open up to our suffering instead of trying to hide it, then I think we're opening up to being fully alive in the world. So that's what I wanted to say this week, and thanks for listening as always. Hope you can join me again soon on Kitchen Sink Dharma.